Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live webcast for the workshop Day 2, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Natasha Poroskova, and I will be your moderator this morning, providing features of the web event technology, managing the chat, and presenting this morning's session facilitator. So before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of the web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the Q&A chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the top where you will type in your questions. To send a question, click in the text box and type your text. When finished, click the Ask button. Your questions will be responded to at the end of the presentation as time permits. So if you submit a question and we don't get to it, we apologize, but we are only going to get to the ones we have time for. Today, we are joined by our session facilitator, David Rowell, Associate Consultant at Folks Consulting. David has a distinguished career as an instructor of leadership, team building, and diversity, and he has worked with UN organizations in promotion of gender mainstreaming, where, among other things, he contributed to international gender equality policy and action planning. I invite you to read David's full bio on the DEI Summit virtual event, because at this time, I would like to turn the microphone over to our session presenter, David Rowell, to get us started. So take it away, David.
Well, thank you very much, Natasha. Pleasure being here. It may have been as much of a pleasure being in Greenville. I wish I were there with everyone to see everyone's faces. But it is what it is. This is the world we live in, and this is what we make the best of. Interesting story, speaking of Zoom, we've all had these problems before, but just this morning, all of a sudden my internet wasn't working, of all days. It's worked faithfully for months and months and months, and of course this morning we had a problem, but here we are, all good to go, and hopefully it'll be an engaging session for everyone this morning. We'll just have to look at me, and I hope to hear from you in the chat with your questions later. And as we go through, if you have something that you really feel needs to be said, get it to the moderator. She'll either get it to me or she'll hold it until the end of the session and we'll be good to go. Because one of the things we do lose when we're doing a presentation like this is the opportunity to really fully interact. And even when I'm doing a stand-up presentation, I'm always willing to pause and have a dialogue. So we'll do that, and maybe at the end, and maybe in chat format, but we'll definitely make the best of it. So here we go on our topic today. Let me get my slides going. And let's take it from the top. Okay. There we are. I titled this program Day 2, Movement Intersectionality, and you'll see why in a bit, but as we go through, I really don't like the idea that topics, movements, issues live in a bubble. I've worked in a number of different areas, as I'll discuss, and a lot of the problems faced by one excluded group is also faced by another. And really, when it comes to social justice, the problems of the world, we're really all in it together. And so I try to take down the walls of isolationism between various groups, various movements, and that's what I want to talk about today. A lot of this goes back to my work, which I'll talk about, but currently here today, I'm working as an associate consultant of Folks Consulting. We at Folks Consulting are a global leader in all things LGBTQ. Doing consulting, doing education, doing training, these type of things. Webinars are obviously very, very popular right now, as you can tell. In addition to that, as Natasha pointed out, I do a lot of work in the realm of gender equality and have written a book, Value and Voice, Solutions to Organizational Gender Balance, and that is on Amazon. But that is not what I'm here to talk about today. To give you a kind of context of this idea I have of why movements shouldn't live in a bubble, and why when we look at social justice and even in the workplace, the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to have kind of a broad view of it, but then I'm going to bring it back down to the workplace, which is where most of us are concerned with. But even in the workplace, issues don't operate separate from each other. One group that's being harangued or discriminated against, those same type of things apply to other groups as well. And I think there's a lot of more room out there for cooperation, which I'll get to. But my view on this has come from the work I've done. A lot of my work I have done in the area of gender equality, as Natasha said, doing it for the federal government, U.S. federal agencies. The work I have done, I've been part of ERGs, employee resource groups, or affinity groups, whichever you like to call them, for women. I've worked with the EEO Commission doing things like reports and stuff with EOC, those type of things. I also led up, ironically, a gender-focused working group, which sometimes gets some eye curdles with thinking that, well, why am I, a male, heading up this gender-focused working group? And I can get into that a little bit, but it was a really great group, and we actually were very, got a lot of amazing things done within the government within that group. And then when I left the government, I started up Parity Consulting, which focuses on the gender equality arena, consulting and training in that area. Along with this work, I have, as Natasha said as well, worked with some UN organizations. I led some women's leadership workshops. I've worked more particularly with gender mainstreaming, but with a organization where we did things like gender action plans. I can say that I've contributed to gender equality policy on an international level, programs like HeForShe and those type of things. This is all the gender equality side of things. But then I also have worked in the realm of LGBTQ. Again, I am an associate of Folks Consulting. At the same time, I did some LGBTQ work with the federal government also. I was a special emphasis program manager for LGBTQ within a federal organization, and again, worked alongside with the EEOC and these type of things. So I've really worked in both these arenas, both the gender equality arena, as well as the LGBTQ arena. And it always has struck me when I've worked in these, I was working in one or the other. There was very little cross-pollination between the issues. When I was a special emphasis program manager for LGBTQ, for example, I didn't bring any of that work into my gender focus working group that I was working in at the same time. And I've always maybe regretted that to a degree, but it really didn't dawn on me at the time. And maybe that's one of the points we can get out here today, that we really have to start thinking of these things not in bubbles, but as ways to interface them together. And at that point, it was my bad. I did not really focus on that at the time. It was only after I left and started my own consulting firm that I thought, wait a minute. And it really came down to, do I want to work in the LGBTQ arena, which I have experience in, or the gender equality? And I'm like, well, why is it a choice? There's a lot of overlaps here. And then I started thinking about it, said, this is really a great topic to look at, is the intersectionality of movements. I will tell you from my experience that a lot more attention, a lot more resources have gone into the gender equality. A lot of the support I've got from leadership within the organizations that I've worked in, that support has largely been more, if nothing else, more obvious with the gender equality side of things than has been with the LGBTQ side of things. I can tell you specifically one federal agency I worked with, their gender equality programs were progressing very, very well, and they got a lot of play within the communications within the organization, and the ERG for LGBTQ at that time struggled to get any kind of traction whatsoever. And of course, to me, that was kind of a little bit of an injustice. Both of these movements have obvious needs, and they both can actually benefit the organization. So here's what I want to do within this next 45 minutes or so, or maybe less, and we can have more discussion, or maybe more, we'll see. I want to talk about how the lessons of one successful movement can benefit another. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how the gender equality movement, those lessons can help get more traction perhaps in some of the LGBTQ movements. How can one movement be broadened out to be more inclusive than another? Because I'll talk about the inclusivity as an issue. We know it's an issue of diversity, but to me, it's also an issue within some of these movements. And I'll point that out on a slide or two. And then how can broad public social justice successes be scaled down and applied locally? And you may have, if you got a copy of these slides, you may have noted that I changed this third bullet here, but that's what I want to do. I want to focus this. I know a lot of you are in corporations, organizations, and have concerns locally, in addition to maybe the broader social justice concerns you have publicly. And so I want to talk about that for sure. So first thing I want to discuss is the idea of intersectionality. And as most of us know it, most of us are familiar with diversity concepts, and maybe this one, maybe not as much, but the idea behind intersectionality is generally that we as individuals have a multifaceted makeup. I may be a white guy, but perhaps, and I'm not, but perhaps I was Jewish, for example, and it may be that that Jewish heritage would be more important to me than the fact that I'm a Caucasian male, for example, but we have layers upon layers. I mean, you could be an African-American woman, at the same time be a single mother, and that aspect of your life certainly weighs in the way you go through your life, the way that others may even interact with you and the way you're treated and those type of things. So it's these different layers, multifaceted, that determine the experiences in our life, how we look at life and how others treat us. I think the same is true of movements. I think a movement is not single layered. If you take the gender equality movement, for example, there's many facets to that. There's actually varying types of feminism. And some people, to be honest, don't even want to use the word feminism around gender equality, which is kind of nuts in my book, because feminism in some circles has a very militaristic sound to it, where gender equality can be more palatable to some people. Obviously, I disagree with that statement, but that's the way it is. There can be layers within a movement of gender equality of what we're really talking about, and where that movement focuses because of that. Now this is, I have a confession here. I started this presentation, as you know, we were brought in, well, you probably don't know this, we were brought in many months ago, and I started working on this presentation. I said, alas, this is my opportunity to talk about this subject of intersectionality between social movements. And I had this great case worked out, how about this movement doesn't work with this movement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then over the summer, Black Lives Matter pops up, and all of a sudden there seemed to be more of a merging of movements. There were a lot of, in addition to the Black Lives Matters protesters, there's a lot of other people from other groups, gender equality, LGBTQ, joining that movement, and maybe not in partnership, but at least in solidarity with those movements. And I saw much more solidarity between movements this past summer, I think, than I had ever seen before. And so I kind of had to change my focus a little bit of this presentation away from these groups never talk to each other, never concern themselves with each other, to this is a good thing that's happened. Out of all the bad that's happened over the summer, at least one aspect that I feel is good is some of these movements are really trying to be more inclusive of others, or at least be more aligned, or being more allies, maybe that's a good term, of each other's as we go along. And you can see it. And what really dawned on me was, even in a lot of the signage that you saw, not only at protests, but in on billboards, on sidewalks, on walls, even in graffiti form, or flags that are flown, these type of things, you can see that there is more intersectionality now between the movements. And again, I look at this as a very positive thing. So at this point, this version of the presentation, I'm not going to rail against it whatsoever. I'm going to embrace that, because this is what I believe. I believe movements can greatly benefit each other. And again, I believe that beneficial camaraderie between movements can also take place in the workplace as well. And we'll get to that. Okay, so there is a history behind this of movements coming together. And if you really think about it, the LGBTQ movement is not an isolated movement in and of itself. There is a multifaceted, or in fact, a intersectional aspect to just LGBTQ in and of itself. most of you know this, not all. There is a huge difference between the letters here. LGBT, for example, or LGB, for example, versus T or Q or I, and we'll get to A later, but we should know what these letters stand for. LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, have to do specifically with sexual orientations, one's sexual preference or one's sexual yearnings for partnership. Whereas trans, and this terminology has evolved over the years, and currently, and maybe correctly so, is looked at primarily as trans women and trans men, transgendered individuals. We get away from the term transsexual, and for a time you might have thrown transvestite in there as well. But at this point in time, we're really talking about trans women and trans men, transgendered individuals. That has nothing to do with sexual orientation. I know a lot of people understand this, and I know there are a lot of people out there that misconstrue this. They believe that gender identity and sexual preference are linked together. They are entirely not. The issues of gender identity vary greatly from those of sexual preference. And then we go on to the Q. Well, what is Q? Well, many years ago, Q might have meant queer, as in that it was equated to your sexual preference also. But now queer is used more in even some non-binary people, which we'll talk about, embrace that terminology as well. And so it's really kind of an umbrella term, but it's less so on the sexual orientation side and more so on the identity side. So that's more a piece of identity at this point. And then we have I, which is intersex, which is nothing but biology. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation whatsoever. Obviously, there's elements of sexuality in there because it's about the body, and there are elements of sexual or gender identity in there because it is about gender, but it's really about biology. What makes a person intersex is they have a indistinct biology in one form or another. That as an issue is, again, separate from sexual preference or identity. And yet, even though all these things are different, sexual preference, sexual identity, biology, these individuals long ago came together and formed a movement because they realized that they can go farther together. Certainly the people that with acceptance of sexual orientation, certainly those people could have gone off and struck up their own movement. Certainly the folks that were struggling with gender identity and getting respect and acknowledgement of their true gender identity, they could have had their own movement entirely separate from the LGBT movement. And certainly those people that identify as queer or non-binary or gender fluid or whatever, they could have had their own movement as well. Likewise, people that were born intersex could have had their own movement. The point here is that as a group, they realized that coming together, there was enough commonalities that they could fight the good fight together. And they realized that they would progress farther together. And I think we just don't have to stop there. Even though LGB folks came together with the Q and the T and the I and the A folks, doesn't mean it has to stop. We can expand and work together in other arenas as well. So gender is looked at as a separate issue, and I'll tell you, working with UN organizations, this is entirely the case. And it saddens me to say that even in the UN arena, gender gets a lot more focus and attention than does LGBTQ issues. And some of the rationale I've heard are things like, well, you know, everyone is male or women. I'm like, well, true. I mean, we could discount intersex if you want because the population is so low, but so it's not entirely true to begin with. But by and large, if we're only looking at biology, yes, we could say that's true. But the truth of the matter is gender is not about biology, it's about our experiences. And that experience is not simply male or female, it's a whole spectrum. So I don't see that why it's separated just on that alone, except for convenience. It is an easy way to position yourself, take a position on. Actually, it's an easy way to enact laws because we can say that this law applies to males and females equitably, or this law applies to males, this law applies to females. And we can see that it's really just a matter of complexity. It's kind of ignoring the true complexity that exists and kind of taking a simplified approach. But that doesn't mean it's not an effective approach. It has been very effective. The gender equality movement, in comparison to the LGBTQ movement, has been much more effective. But it's not a separate issue in my mind. We may see everyone as male and female, and thus that's easily identifiable. But statistically, many of us also know people who are LGBT. We know people that are trans, for example. We know them in our homes. We know them in our offices. We know them in our workplaces. We know them in our schools and in our churches. And so just saying that, well, we're familiar with male and female, therefore, we can approach problems in that simplified way, I think misses the mark. I think we want to look at it more complex of what really gender means and what really gender equality means, because gender equality means equality for all genders, not just male, not just female, but those that might be intersex, for example, those that would be trans women or trans men, for example, those that would be considered non-binary. So gender equality would also include them as well. And so we want to look at not as a separate issue and then bring these things together in that respect as well. There are intersections between the two movements. One of those intersections is where the discrimination comes from, where the marginalization comes from. A lot of that is the same, whether you're looking at discrimination against women versus discrimination against someone that may be gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or discrimination against someone that may be trans, or discrimination against someone who may be non-binary. A lot of it is simply that the power group, which is typically male, trying to exert privilege over the perceived less powerful group. Whether that's female or whether that's trans, it's the same condition causing the problem in that case. Another has to do, and I really don't have time to go into it today, but I'd love to, is the idea of discrimination based on gender norms and expectations. Gender norms and expectations drive a lot of the discriminatory practices for women, and likewise, they drive a lot of the discriminatory practices against LGBTQ folks as well. Then another intersection would be the effects. The effects on women are largely the same effects that are happening to LGBT folks, both sphere and within the work sphere, professional spheres, and those being discrimination and safety concerns. As it comes to discrimination, for example, this figure, and it's been modified somewhat from year to year, but typically you see something around that women earn 70 cents on the dollar compared to male wages. Well, for LGBTQ folks, that's actually 68% on the dollar, which is the latest figure I saw. So that's very proportionate discrimination, if you want to look at it that way, and that's just one marker we can deal with. Why are we so concerned about pay equity between men and women, and then we don't really talk about pay equity between individuals, for example, and trans individuals, and yet the same type of discrimination exists. One area I want to really focus in on is the safety issue, because I feel that this is one of those issues that really has gotten a lot of attention, and even though the issue itself is very, very bad in nature, the outcomes have been good in that the attention has brought about at least awareness, if not change, and that is the safety, particularly with the Me Too movement, has brought a lot of this to light, how much sexual harassment is prevalent in our society and in our workplaces. But understand that sexual harassment that takes place against women, those same type of things are happening to our LGBTQ folks, and yet are not getting the same type of attention. I believe if they were given the same type of attention, we'd begin the same type of progress that's coming on the behalf of women. And I'm not going to say that that progress is all rosy. Certainly it should be much, much better than it is. But yet there is progress, at least in terms of awareness, if not improvement. So again, here's a case where the situation is very similar between these two movements, and yet one is getting much more success and kind of going in alone, and the other one's kind of getting left behind. And I just feel that if these movements could come together more, we could see progress made on behalf of most of both sides, perhaps. One thing I'll point out here, and this is very alarming, the number of murders of people. I was really heartened the other night when I watched Joe Biden's town hall, when he actually brought up trans murders within his town hall, one of his answers, because it's very egregious. It's very sickening, if you will. The number of trans women that are being murdered out there. And it's largely trans women, by the way, not trans men. Again, going back to the source of the problem that has to do with gender norms and expectations in large part. The point here is that the Me Too movement did a very good job of highlighting the illness of sexual harassment on women and brought that to the forefront of a lot of people's discussions. And yet at the same time, the murder of transgender women is not getting the same type of attention and awareness. And I just feel that if we could do the same thing if we had like a Me Too movement for transgender, for example, and that was given the same type of attention, we could see equal progress in that realm as well. So why don't we? Again, why people don't act on behalf of gender equality or on behalf of the LGBTQ movement, again, are largely the same. They have, maybe it's a bystander effect. We don't necessarily feel that it's our job to get involved. And here again, I think that was the case up until Me Too really got involved. I think the Me Too made bystanders feel a little guilty perhaps, or at least take ownership and responsibility that they just cannot stand by and let this happen, given the prominence of the sexual harassment that was taking place. But the bystander effect is one of the reasons why people won't stand up on behalf of women. And the same reason why they won't stand up on behalf of LGBTQ folks as well. So again, we've gotten past that a little bit in the Me Too movement. And another thing that's helped bystander effect in the workplace is a simple thing like reporting procedures. And I'll get to this in a little bit, but when it became easy for people to report things on behalf of their fellow workers, colleagues, they could still be a bystander in the sense that they can still be anonymous, but they can also be active. And we just need to do that same thing for LGBTQ folks. It's a little bit tricky because not all LGBTQ folks are out. We don't go around assuming anyone's sexual orientation, for example. But if it's known, if we know an individual is trans, for example, or if we know someone that's very proud to call themselves non-binary or gender fluid or queer or whatever identity they wish, and they're very proud of that as they can be, and yet they're being discriminated against, we need to make sure that our bystanders have a means to report that discrimination, that harassment, those inequities there as well. Then another one that's reason why people don't get involved is conformity. We don't, for our own self-preservation, we feel it's best to conform with the group we're working with. We want to be seen as part of the team, not as an outsider, for example. And so it can be very stressful if we step away from our group and even call our group out or call out members in our group, or even act in ways that the rest of the group is not acting. Have we gone over this in the area of gender equality? A little bit, because I think it's been made, maybe I won't use the word kosher or appropriate to be allies of women in the workplace. On some level, stepping aside and calling out your group or doing other things on behalf of women in the workplace has reached some level of acceptability. That same level of acceptability, however, has not been reached for LGBTQ folks. So the conformity is a bigger issue in that realm. If we stand out as an ally of someone who's trans in our workplace, for example, that's more of a risk still than it is if we stand out to be an ally of women in the workplace. It's still hurdles. Allies still face hurdles of being allies of women in the workplace also. It's just not near as big of a hurdle as being allies of LGBTQ folks, because we don't want to stand out and stand aside. So that's another issue to be overcome. And then the psychological standing, well, it doesn't affect me. This kind of goes back to the point I made earlier about gender. We look at women, we say, yeah, I can understand the issues of gender equality, or rather inequality. I can understand because I have a daughter, or I have a wife, I have a sister, I have a mother, I have friends that are female. I can understand the harassment they may face, possibly. I may understand some of the discrimination. I may understand even the small micro inequities that they may be subjected to. And I can empathize with that because I know people like that. Whereby when it comes to LGBTQ folks, we just don't have the same level of understanding. And I would argue that's primarily because we haven't really necessarily tried to gain that same level of understanding. Certainly, if we grew up with a sister that we were close to, and we could see that her experience, professional experience, varies greatly different than my own, I can emphasize with that. But it's hard for me, unless I grew up with a person in my family that was gay, I may not be able to have that same level of understanding, and therefore I just erase myself from the conversation in a sense. I just step aside from it and I just figure I don't have a dog in this fight. And that's another one of those big hurdles we have to overcome. It was a hurdle to be overcome in the women's equality movement as well. We had to make men realize that the benefits of women's equality benefits men as well. And statistically, I go to do gender equality events, and I'm constantly giving out the statistics about how gender equality benefits all. And there is tons and tons of statistics, as you can imagine, and yet try to find that same thing to convince an audience that they need to be vested in the experience of the LGBTQ folks that they may know, or even the ones they don't really know, but are known to be out there, trying to get them vested in that. It's harder to come up with that evidence and to convince them that there's a why there, why they should. And so that psychological standing remains another hurdle to be overcome. So how do we pull these movements together? And just for example, that I've been using here, the gender equality movement with the LGBTQ movement. Well, we can start with inclusive feminism. You may or may not have heard the term, but basically the feminist movement has not been all-inclusive. You might think that includes all women, but then some people get into having a very distinct definition of what women means. I can tell you there are groups that are violently opposed to trans women being part of the feminist movement. I'm not going to get into the whys of that. I'm just going to say that if we really want to start leveraging the strength of movements working together, we have to get away from this notion of exclusive feminism. We have to make it inclusive of not only trans women, we have to make the movement inclusive of non-binary persons. We have to make the movement inclusive of intersex, of course. We have to make the movement inclusive of men. And this has happened to a degree. You've seen that a lot of male allies have not only been allied with the movement, have also been taken into the movement and have been allowed to speak on the movement's behalf. It's not always the case. I can tell you that I have gotten pushback just doing gender equality work as a male. I've gotten pushback leading women's leadership workshops as I have internationally, for example. But for movements to really be the most effective, they need to be all inclusive. We need all hands on deck. Everyone can add to the strength of the movement and propel it forward. And so we start by ensuring that we have inclusive feminism and not exclusive feminism as a starting point. Another thing that's very helpful, which has been leveraged very well under Me Too, HeForShe, Time's Up, and these type of things, is inserting personal stories into the narrative. Personal stories are one of the best ways that you can move people's perspective. The best way you can move someone's perspective is with personal stories. They've done a very good job under these other women's equality movements, Me Too, HeForShe, Time's Up, etc., in making the personal story move people, and it has. We need to do a better job of that in the LGBTQ arena, and people have to be open to hearing those messages. Again, going back to the number of trans women that were murdered in this country this past year, 38 of them, we need to hear those stories. And if we can find ways to get those stories out there, they will move people. I will tell you this, one of the best experiences I had, I was working with a federal organization, and the organization was struggling moving the LGBTQ movement forward within the organization until the director of that organization, who had never come out before, came out as lesbian, released a video of a statement on that, and that moved more minds within the organization than anything had done for years and years and years and years. The power of personal stories, and we need to leverage that as the other movements have. With the LGBTQ movement in particular, we need to end stigma. Unfortunately, it's still traumatizing to a degree in some cases, or at least risky for people to come out in some workplaces. And because of that stigma, they're unwilling to share their stories. And so in a sense, we got to get rid of the stigma first, and then so that those stories can be shared. It's hard for me to ask you to be an ally of mine. If I were gay, for example, it'd be hard for me to request you to be an ally of mine if I fear letting you even know that fact. So we got to get rid of the stigma first, and then we can get on to the personal stories. Can be allies. Who doesn't love RBG, right? An ally of both movements. We can all be allies of both movements is what I want to say here. Maybe many of you have been vested in the gender equality movement in the public sphere or in your organizations. Maybe you have been allies. Maybe you have worked fighting for equalities within the workplace, for example, or equalities in the public sphere on behalf of women and men. Maybe you've done HeForShe, whatever. By the same token, we can not only be allies of women, we can also be allies of the LGBTQ folks at the very same time. Because being an ally for one group is the same as being an ally for the next. It takes things like self-educating yourself of what the issues are. It takes things like listening to what the concerns of the group are and individuals of that group, what their individual concerns are. It means things like supporting these individuals, be they women or trans women or lesbian, whatever the case may be. It means listening to them and finding out what their issues are and being supportive of that and being advocates of that. If we advocate for women, we can use the same advocation techniques for LGBT folks as well. If we write articles or if we vocally do things on behalf of women, we can do those same things on behalf of LGBTQ folks. So to be a good ally, it takes three things. National Science Foundation has found. They have to have insider knowledge of organizations, speaking organizationally. It's really the people in the power positions that are in the best position to be the most powerful allies because they know how the organization operates. But anyone with a good understanding of how the organization functions can make a very good ally because they can use that to their benefit. Second, they show genuine understanding of the inequities for women or inequities for LGBTQ folks as well. Understand, again, do some self-education, some self-edification to learn what those costs are, learn the experiences, and then finally commit to those. Again, whether we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace or harassment against trans people in the workplace, it takes the same things. All right. Last thing I'd say is organizational sponsorship. Again, it saddens me that the UN and some of these international bodies have been so wonderful at taking up the cause of improving the situation for women worldwide, where at the same time, they've not done as much for LGBT folks. There are exceptions. For example, Amnesty International, of course, has certainly taken up the LGBTQ flag. But within our own organization, how many organizations have you been associated with? There have been high proponents of women in the workplace, but have not had the same level of commitment or vocalization or activity towards LGBTQ folks in the workplace. So we need to equalize that out. So this is what I want to wrap up with. How do we scale this down? Start with education. A starting point for many is unconscious bias, and unconscious bias as a training platform works to fill any movement. That includes Black Lives Matter, equalities based on race in the workplace. Any marginalization, bias, discrimination can be tackled with education. I would take a step further. I always advocated we need gender education. For one thing, we need to understand what gender really means. It's not just male versus female, but we need gender education. And really, the thing I would like to see is more education on how men and women and everyone in the workplace get together and work together. Secondly, we need champions within local organizations taking up the cause of, again, not just women, but taking up the cause of everyone in the workplace, including the LGBTQ folks. We talked about allies. That also includes mentors and sponsors. If we go mentor women, I can tell you there are disparities between in promotions as much as there are disparities for women. And again, the statistics are even worse for LGBT folks getting promotions within some organizations. And so they need mentors and sponsors, not only as much as women do, but maybe more so. And so we need to take that consideration. Another thing, I'm a big advocate of ERGs working together. Again, I've worked with women ERGs, women empowerment groups, and I've worked with ERGs and LGBTQ, and they've worked isolated in bubbles where one would be highly resourced, one would get a lot of attention, one would get a lot of organizational support, and the other was left floundering. If these ERGs will work together, share resources, share activities, I guarantee that propels both ERGs forward, both, if not all. And then you can bring in the, maybe the Hispanic ERG in there or something like that and have them all working together. They become much, much more powerful. Don't work in isolated bubbles and they become a much more powerful thing. And then finally have the dialogue. As much as we're now willing to talk about pay inequities between men and women, let's have the same conversation about pay inequities between males, cis or straight males and gay males, for example, those type of things. Okay. And finally, I want to let you take this home with homework for what can we learn from the Black Lives Matter movement? I've talked a lot about what lessons we might take away from the gender equality movement or how we could merge those movements together. But what about the Black Lives Matter movement? Whether you see that as making a lot of progress this year or not, or whether you see it as hitting your head against the wall, I think there's great lessons to be learned there that we can take and apply, and also make sure that Black Lives Matter is inclusive as well. And by and large it is. But really work, any injustice in my book is injustice. Tackle the idea of injustice and inequity and not do it so in such isolated group would be the final message I have to say here today. So with that, I'll wrap up. It's been a pleasure. I wish I could be there in person, but I hope that this opened your eyes a little bit to how these groups do not have to be isolated and how they could actually come together, learn from each other, and propel each other forward. And I'll leave it on that note, and I'll turn it back to our moderator, Natasha. Do you have anything for me?
Thank you, David, for the great conversation. We do have a handful of questions that have come in. I will go ahead and start with the most recent question that just came in from Jill. She asked, how do you move the LGBTQ movement forward if you don't have leaders who are LGBTQ, but you have people throughout the organization who are?
I think first step is the awareness issue. I think a lot of leaders, for one, aren't even aware of the disparities. Even, I bet you couldn't go to many leaders and say, what's the pay disparity between men and women, and then ask them what the pay disparity is between straight people in the workplace and gay people, and they have no clue. And I'm not saying just awareness on these statistical things, but even the awareness on the experience as well. And so starting first and foremost, we have to make them aware. They don't have to know what everyone's sexual orientation is in the workplace. But what you can do is say, did you know that maybe 10% of our workforce is actually gay? Or did you know that you may not realize that such and such percent of the workplace may identify as non-binary, for example? And do you even know what non-binary means? And start that education piece first and foremost, because a lot of it is the fact that, yeah, we all know males, we all know females, so it's easy to see the gender equality disparities, but we don't know who's trans, who's non-binary, who's gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. And maybe we can't point out individuals, and we shouldn't unless they're willing to do so, but we can still do it statistically. So it's like, did you know that X number of your workforce might identify as this, and that they're being subject to these types of discrimination? The harassment statistics, for example, could be very eye-opening. Okay.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from Bharat. I apologize if I mispronounced that. The question is, what specific suggestions do you have for companies or organizations in the South, a historically conservative or religious part of the country, to further LGBTQ plus rights?
I really, one of the hardest things to do is to change someone's outlook or perspective on a problem or an issue or even a group of people. And this is where I go back to the point of the personal stories. I know personal stories can move people from positions that they're very, very cemented into. How we can do it is maybe convince some leadership in some of these more conservative areas to at least hear some stories of trans murders, for example. And then, and not just give them statistics of, did you know that 38 trans women were murdered next year? But actually talk about, in Dallas, this woman was murdered. And, she worked in an organization very much like ours. She was in a professional position within that organization. And yet this was her experience, and talk about it. If there are people in the organization willing to come forward and share their own stories, that can be very powerful, like the story I told you about the director of our organization that came out as lesbian, and that moved a lot of people's minds. I don't want to say go out and identify those people, but if they have made themselves known, and we can ask them if they're willing to take the risks that are associated with being more prominent, if they can meet with leadership and tell their stories. Because I really think that stories move things like nothing else. And then also the statistics help as well.
Great, thank you for that. Our next question is from Annette. She asks, I am an approachable person. Other than treating everyone with respect, how can people know I am a safe, judgment-free person? How do I help without, quote unquote, outing a person?
You know what, you can just make yourself known as an ally without saying specifically what you're allying for. You can simply go up to people, really what you want to do is help the people that are being subjected to even things like micro inequities or whatever, and just say, you know, you're facing some hurdles. I just want to be an ally to that. You don't have to say, point them out, say it's because you're this or because you're that. You just say, I know you've been struggling here for whatever reasons. Just know that I'm here for you and I'm here to help you. And tell them what you're there to do, and not make them have to talk about what it is that they're experiencing, unless they're willing to talk about that. Say if you care to talk about your experience, that's fine. Otherwise, whatever it's causing you these problems, just know that I'm here for you. The problems may be because they may have nothing to do with being female. They may have nothing to do with even being LGBTQ. Maybe they're struggling because of financial problems or something like this. But just knowing that we've got someone's back, if we recognize that they're struggling, we don't necessarily have to know the reason they're struggling. We just have to let them know that we recognize they're struggling and are there to help.
Great. Our next question comes in from Sharita. She says, can you share any success stories you've seen within organizations where movement intersectionality has been successful? And if so, what made it successful?
I think one of the things you can do, what's made it successful, I recently consulted with a group that wanted to do more in the Black Lives Matter arena, actually. And I said, well, one of the things you could do, I said, do you have other ERGs in your organizations that have done well? And they said yes. I said, bring in those experiences to your new Black Lives Matter. They wanted to create a Black Lives Matter action plan. I said, you have the experience with successful ERGs, bring some of those people over. So the first thing I do is cross-pollinate. Just because we have 10 individuals that are working in the, let's say the Hispanic ERG, and we got 10 individuals working in the Asian American ERG, doesn't mean that those 10 people all have to be Hispanic and those 10 people all have to be Asian American, and the Asian Americans can't go out and help the Hispanic ERG. First thing you do is cross-pollinate, so that you have people in multiple groups so that they can be that conduit to feed information from one group to another. You know what, in this other ERG I'm involved with, we've done this and this was highly successful. Or you know what, we tried that in this other ERG I'm working with and we kind of fell flat on our face. And so we can share those lessons learned. Or maybe even if you don't want to have membership shared between multiple affinity groups or ERGs, set up some kind of communication conduit between the groups so that they can share these lessons learned. Because I think that's very important. They don't necessarily have to, they'll be most powerful when they can work together, but before that, they at least have to start as a starting point, communicating together so that they know what each other is doing. So start there. And then once they start talking to each other, they can very well identify projects that they can take on together or initiatives that they can do together. Or they may decide that, you know what, this initiative is better suited for this ERG or that initiative is better suited for that ERG. But at least having that dialogue can determine what's going to work best for all the affinity groups and not just what works best for one of them.
And I wanted to ask a little bit further on that. What is your take on executive sponsors for affinity groups and ERGs? So let's say for potentially a Black employee's ERG and there's a white executive sponsor. What's your take on, including allies in that and amplifying?
I think that can be worked if and only if that's understood that that's the case. I've seen a lot of sponsorship ERGs or affinity groups just as a checkbox. Oh, as a leader, it would look good if I was sponsored this ERG, right? That's not. There's really a fine balance point. You need the sponsor to take ownership of the ERG, and they should be able to state why they're a sponsor of that ERG, not only for their own personal reasons why they're a sponsor, but also in the interest of the organization. They should be able to state both, why this is important to me and why it's important to the organization. And they should state that in a public forum, number one. On the other hand, they can't go too far, because I've seen it the other way, where sponsors go in and try to micromanage the ERG or the affinity group, and that's not their role either. Their best role is to give credibility and authority to the group. That is their only role. To give credibility, they have to be able to explain that why piece. Why am I doing this as a personal interest of myself and as of a professional interest to the organization, and also be able to let the affinity group or the ERG decide for itself or set its own course. But that's where the credibility comes from the sponsor, but not necessarily direction, because I've seen of direction, many sponsors micromanaging ERGs, and that doesn't work either. I've seen ERGs crash and burn. They're being very successful. I was a member of one, a very successful ERG, and then all of a sudden the sponsor decided that they wanted to be more involved, and it just drove that ERG into the ground.
Thank you for that, for adding that extra context. We have not a whole lot of time left, so we have maybe one or two more questions. This next question is from Erin. She says, as an open out lesbian in my workplace, I often become the assigned for all LGBTQ topics, concerns, issues, etc. And while I appreciate that and an honor to support my organization and provide insight, I cannot speak for an entire community. What are some ways and resources that I can recommend?
One of the things you could do is at the next event is introduce allies and get the shift off of yourself. And so you're not the only person speaking to that group. You may not, maybe there's not others in the organization that want to be outed, but your allies can't be allies unless they step forward. So if there's not others in the organization willing to help you carry the mantle, have your allies do that. If they really want to be allies, they'll do that for you. So at some future events, get your allies more involved, and so it's not all on you. It's one suggestion I have there.
Okay, and we're going to do one more quick question. This question comes in from Mildred. She says, can you provide more insights on why acceptance is perceived as an easier road within organizations for dominant females of the LGBTQ community?
Maybe Mildred could rephrase that question, or maybe I'll go back and read it again. Do you have it? It's in the chat, or give it to me again, Natasha.
It's, can you provide more insight on why acceptance is perceived as an easier road within organizations for dominant females of the LGBTQ community?
Okay. The only thing I can think of that is, in a sense, it's an easier road for anyone dominant. The harder one fights for something, eventually you're going to make some progress. And so while it may look to be an easier road, in reality, it's the same road for everyone. It's just that the dominant person has fought more of the battle, have more of the battles behind them than they have in front of them. I would say for anyone that is a path leader like that, or path paver like that, there's some responsibility in that. If that is you, if you are the one that have that dominance has made you more effective, I'm putting this on you. If that's you, you have responsibility to ensure that that path is open for those that follow you. They may not be as able to do what you have done. Take that upon yourself. And that's a good leadership trait. If you really want to be leaders and represent your group, don't forget those that are left behind. So well, I think I think that question, I think, is a matter of perception. It may be perceived that the dominant person has had an easier path, but I'd say it's really been just the same hard path that they just got more behind them.
Well, thank you for that, David. We are out of time here. If you had questions and you weren't able to get them answered, feel free to connect with David on LinkedIn. So with that, on behalf of Greenville Chamber's 4th Annual DEI Summit and presenting sponsor Michelin North America, I'd like to thank David Rowell and all of you for your participation in the They Too workshop. At this time, you may transition to the next segment of today's summit as per the agenda, and this concludes our session. So thank you again, David, and all of our attendees, and enjoy the rest of today's summit.
Thank you.